Lapit Jot. Oh, there's Vibhuti. Hi, Vibhuti. I started early just to welcome everyone, but I'll start the channel with you. Let's see, I'm going to invite you. There we go. Sup now?
Oh, there you are. Okay.
There's Vibhuti. Hey.
Hi, Satnam. This is such a new forum.
I know. You just did your third Instagram post ever today.
And it only took me 2 days to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
My students were like, okay, here's what you do. And I said, are you guys just eating popcorn and laughing at me right now? Oh, that's so funny. This is like an interesting, very cool.
Yeah. Hey, welcome to my home, Vibhuti.
Oh, yeah. Welcome to our growth chart. I do this, I've been doing a lot of calls around this topic, obviously. And what's interesting is there's my kid's growth chart right in the back. So,
Oh,
oh, did I do a filter of some sort? Weird.
yeah, you're
Um, and so I kind of say that this is like this is what we're talking about, growth, you know?
yeah.
So it's very apropos.
Oh, look, and we're in Brazil too. Hi, Ronan.
All right.
Yes, we're all over the world right now. It's
Wow.
wonderful. We have a community.
That's amazing. And people eager to obviously talk about this topic, but also figure out how they can actually impact, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So now it's 2 o'clock. So thank you everyone for joining us. And this our discussion will be available afterwards. I'll save it, and it'll load up to my Instagram page. And with this topic, we only have 20 minutes, and I just figured for online as a first conversation starter, attention span, we'll max it out at 20 minutes, and do our best to cover some of this groundwork and give you some tools and answer some of the questions that have come up. And Vibhuti texted me before this. I don't think we can answer all these questions. But we're both Sagittarians. We'll try our best.
At least to get it started.
Yeah. Great. So let's start off just taking just a moment of intention and prayer, awareness for right now is the George Floyd Memorial, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So the memorial for George Floyd is happening right now, and really just sending our prayers, our intentions, our good energy towards the healing of the situation. And just let's take a moment in silence, closing your eyes. Feeling that sense of peace within yourself, and that peace in all of our surroundings. Great. So we will continue to honor this movement through conversations like this. So thank you, Vibhuti, for joining me today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And so I know this is your profession. You discuss about race and structural racism, how to address it, and also clinically how to address it as well through the lens of social justice. And I saw some of your Facebook posts, and I reposted it to Instagram. I was like, wow, this is so beautiful.
Thank you.
And then I sent you an email about just ways that we can help out, practical ways that all of us can help out right now, especially here in America. And you responded, you texted me the next morning like, hey, just reaching out. And I was like, perfect, this is what we need to do.
That's great. Yeah. I think the first is to kind of acknowledge what's happening, right? So I think that there's historically and in recent events just been a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And I think that, and certainly marginalized groups sort of throughout history have felt this. And I think this notion of this racial superiority of whiteness, first it's a made up construct, right? It's a total construct to do exactly that. And I think that what I want to acknowledge is that it hurts everybody, right? So it actually hurts white people because they've been stripped of their cultural identities and just been called white. It strips people, certainly people of color, in understanding that there's structurally sort of is baked into every conceivable part of society, this notion of racial superiority. And I think part of it is understanding that, this pandemic, which also has highlighted so many inequities in health in general. Everything in an emergency sort of gets magnified, right? So the inequities have certainly magnified during this pandemic. And I think that it's actually the silver lining perhaps is that it's allowed people a time to pause and reflect. And I think that that's why we've made history in understanding that there's an awakening of this topic across this country. Every state has had some form of protest or another. And, you know, historically speaking, this might be a pivotal moment, and I think largely stirred by the pandemic, because if people had to go to work, this would have been another piece of news and business as usual, right? And I think that's what it's asking us to do, is say, let's take a pause and understand that this is not new. This injustice is not new. And I know that there has been a lot of focus on like the violence and the looting, and where I understand that there may be pain associated with that, you know, again, kind of ask us to take pause to say, you know, there are people who've been looted of their human rights, of basic decency, of, you know, breaking up families by shooting somebody just because they looked a certain way or threatened your being somehow. And it's not okay. So it's not okay to continue that narrative and say, you know, sorry that, you know, Black folks have been feeling this, sorry that somebody got shot, but it's not okay to do violence. And if we just kind of like flip it for a second, right? Like, sorry the buildings got looted, sorry that people are facing, you know, the hysteria or the looting and the protest, but it's not okay that somebody's son or father or daughter or mother gets shot, right? So I think if we just start thinking about flipping the narrative a little bit, and number one, just acknowledging how deep structural racism is, I think that's how you get the conversation started. I've had a lot of people who kind of ask about, you know, I'm a white person, what do I do? And yoga teachers in particular, right? Like, so we're all about creating space, right? We're all about holding that space and elevating ourselves to this sort of transcendental way of being and thinking about it as a spiritual self. And I know we've had questions about this as well for this event, that, you know, there are people who are like, yeah, but we're above all of this. And while I understand that we are here to hold that space and tap into that, you know, I'm a spiritual person having an earthly experience, so to speak, there is acknowledgement that needs to be had, right? Just like, you know, we care for our bodies because they're tangible things here, right? Just like that, we have to care for our minds and our soul. And you know, sometimes I think it's kind of like the yogi's version of I don't see color, right? Like, oh, it's okay because we're all above this. We're, you know, and that's not helpful when people are trying to process what's going on.
Yeah.
There are physical, psychosomatic responses in their bodies to this level of stress that they walk around with, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that's a really important point, is to think about, do what you can to validate and acknowledge what's happening. And it's okay not to have the perfect vocabulary or framework or perfect thing to say. You will likely say something. We all do. We all will make mistakes. And I think part of it is accepting that. And being okay with failing so that we can all uplift each other. It's okay to be vulnerable. Absolutely. Because we're here to hold that space.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And yeah, I've also had so many people reaching out to me. And I had one colleague who reached out to me, and they shared an Instagram story that they had made. And in the Instagram story, they put this collage of, like, so this person is white. And so he did a collage of him with all of his Black friends, like all the pictures throughout his life of being with Black people. And then it was like the quote underneath it was just like, you know, something along the lines of like, I love Black people. Look at all the Black people I've hung out with.
Right.
And, you know, I took a moment to pause, and I just responded, like, because understanding the intention is there, the heart center is there, but that delivery, you know, just comes across like, and I explained to him just really, you know, just sharply. I was just like, you know, you're putting Black people as trophies. You know,
right.
Your heart and your intention is there, but it's not going to necessarily help what's happening right now.
Well,
and
also,
the conversation brought up something really beautiful.
Yeah, and your friends are not statistics. They're not, you know, there's no quota that you go around filling, right? And you don't get a ticket just because you have an immigrant friend, a Black friend, whatever. And I think part of that is because we're also dealing with, if you think about the generation before us, right, they were taught to be colorblind, so to speak. That was the coping, right? That was the conversation. And every generation has had hopefully some conversation around this, but these constructs that come out end up damaging their response and their coping mechanism. And, you know, there's a notion of like, well, the next generation will be better. And they're not, unless we hold the conversation for them, right? Otherwise, they're just going to keep perpetuating. And I actually don't think it's fair to kind of put the burden on them, and it doesn't give me a ticket out, right? I need to talk to my kids about this. And the issue here is that I always, you know, when I teach about this, I always say intention versus impact, right? So we all have kind of said this thing about like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, you know, and that's a half-ass apology, right? Like that is not a proper apology, right? Like you're exonerating yourself of any accountability in that exchange, but really what needs to be happening is understanding the impact and being accountable to that impact. And I think part of what's happening is that because people don't know how to have this conversation or be vulnerable around this topic, their defense or their coping mechanism is to put together that collage, right? To show that they're not bad people, to show some alignment, not realizing, you know, that that's actually toxic and perpetuating. And I think that it is a moment to have that clarity and have that conversation and say, look, this is well intended, but the impact is not, I think, what you intended it to be. And here's how it looks from this perspective.
Yeah. The support. And I see it also in terms of like that dynamic of consciousness, because racism, understanding it, it's more than just even our ideas. Racism is a whole structure that most or many societies, especially American society, has been built off of. And what's happening right now energetically is that rot has a chance to be cleared. It's like within our meditation practice. We work not to distract ourselves, but to actually address our own shadows, address our unresolved, address the garbage within, that discomfort, and allow it to elevate. And so that's the opportunity for all of us in the spiritual, all the different spiritual communities. And I also see it like in terms of consciousness, there's different levels of racism in terms of consciousness. Like there's conscious racism, like someone consciously is afraid of Black people. Someone consciously may feel that they're superior because of their skin color, that they're nicer or smarter because of skin color. Then there's maybe someone doesn't have that, but there's subconscious racism, and those project out like microaggressions.
Yes, and that's the notion of the implicit biases, right?
Yeah.
So, and the way that I make it relevant, for example, clinically, right? When you're thinking about health equity, for example, when a clinician who is trained to know the answers and to make decisions and solve problems, for example, in the pandemic, if you're a clinician, if you're treating a patient and you've got one vent and now you all of a sudden have to make a decision between two people, when we're in heightened anxiety, when we're, and any parent, right, all humans know this, but definitely parents who've been through this, you know, all your inside stuff comes out. You start operating from a space that holds all of your fears and your insecurities. And so having that burden or having that sort of inkling to say, I'm going to make a decision based on what, right? So in clinical spaces, we talk about crisis standards of care. Like, how do we bring equity? How do we bring deliberate anti-racism and uncover implicit biases so that clinicians who are making those choices and operating from that subconscious level are at least conscious of it and speaking about it during times where they don't have to make those decisions, during like quote unquote normal times, so that when the emergency comes, you can kind of recognize what's happening, right? So when we meditate, exactly what you're saying, it's not avoiding topics, it's going through them very deliberately to be aware and bring that consciousness to your space, to be in that center and be able to, through your practice, tap into it when need be. But to do that, you do have to embrace being uncomfortable. You do have to embrace this idea that that's going to make me feel uneasy. And that's okay. And you're not supposed to be invincible in front of your patients or your whoever those constituents are, right? Your class, your students, your kids. That it's okay for us to see each other as vulnerable human beings, even though we have times where we may transcend that identity from an earthly being into a more spiritual realm. But like, we still have to acknowledge what this earth is going through and how we as individuals in this reality walk around either being very deliberate about it and being conscious, or just perpetuating these notions and these biases.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the key. And it's just like so those that may be new to these topics, like you can do a lot of research, but like a microaggression, for example, I think of it's like the subconscious bias. So you're projecting, like I've received a lot, and it's like, wow, Amanbir, you're so smart for a Black person, or just
Yes.
someone thinking they're saying something of good intention, but it's these subconscious biases that are rooted in racism.
Yeah, my favorite is the good for you. And oh man,
Yeah.
I definitely have to meditate through that one.
But let's say
Um,
somebody doesn't have either conscious or subconscious racism. It's still, so then they could say like, I'm not a racist because I don't
sure.
have either. But then what's coming through a lot with this movement, which I find is really beautiful part, is the idea of anti-racism. To be an anti-racist is understanding that the system in place, the society in place, has been created to exploit people of color, to exploit Black people, and it's like this unspoken totem pole, with Black people
Yes.
being at the bottom and whites being at the top. And as long as society is still structured off of this dynamic and you are living in that society, you are racist, which I
And
know is a
every,
very startling
yes,
concept.
it totally is. And I think the way that I broach this topic is by reminding people that there are two prongs to this. There's an individual, are you interpersonally racist person? And then there's a structural component, right? Exactly what you're saying, that society has been built around this. If you look at our laws, if you look at policies, it actually is interesting because the conversation moved from being very explicitly racist to now not being explicit, but more implicit, where there are sort of what we call race neutral laws and policies and standards that have very racist consequences. And when you see that, right? So when I teach health disparities, I say that when you see different communities being disproportionately affected, you
Yeah.
need to wake up to that and say, why is that actually happening? So in a similar way, I think people can get around to two concepts that, one is like a community cleanup, right? If there is litter all over on your block, you may not necessarily be throwing things out every single day to cause that, but that is the state of what it is. And you need to, the anti-racist thing is that I need to deliberately go and clean it up, not just be a passive walking by and kind of ignoring it or turning the other cheek. And I think that, and that's what it means to be deliberately working to make that more conscious. And I think the other one is that, understanding white privilege and what that means in these circles is really important and impactful when you acknowledge that. So similarly, I think everybody can get behind the notion that, you can't give everybody a trophy, right? You can't give every child a trophy. It doesn't do good. So white privilege is that trophy that every white person has been given. They didn't earn it. It's just there. And we all have different forms of privilege, right? We all have houses, we have assets, we have things that we can count on that we didn't earn, that somebody else earned for us. But this idea about white privilege and how very specific it is needs to just be acknowledged, right? Like I went through actually a really tough struggle with me doing teacher training and trained by all white people about my own culture, right? And I noticed that the ways that concepts and sayings and mantras were being interpreted, I was like, that's not deliberate. They're just telling you to take a shower because in the 60s nobody took showers, right? Like there's nothing magical, right? And so there were these concepts that I really struggled with, and I didn't have the vocabulary at that time to think about this, but I definitely noted that there was this tension without even an acknowledgement of what that means, right? So yes, you have, for example, I have dear friends who are white Sikhs who walk around with the turban, and of course there's vulnerability there, but still a certain amount of privilege there, separate from a brown person wearing a turban and still being impacted by hate crimes, for example, right? So these are ways in which I think that as yogis, we have been taught to transcend these identities, but that we need to acknowledge with our students that, we're fortunate to have been going into this culture and learning from it and now getting paid to teach it, right? And I think that it's really important to acknowledge these privileges. It's important to acknowledge that when our community is suffering, that we are like pieces of a puzzle. If you miss a couple of pieces, it's different. It's not going to make the whole puzzle work, right? And so that's how humanity is. We are all in this together, and you can't be a passive member. That you have to think about each person as being unique, but acknowledge the deep pain and hurt that there is. And so, I have dear friends who, are telling their husbands they're black, and they're like, don't go out, don't go to Target to get milk, because if you look suspicious, and they're professionals and PhDs and went to Harvard and all of that stuff. And I think that's the extent to which you have to think about for a moment. If these injustices were done in your family to your community, would it be okay for you to condemn the looting? Like, I get it. The violence is not the answer, but there is such deep pain under that, that if we just take a moment to acknowledge that, I think it's really, really powerful to understand where that's coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to look at it from a wider lens, and just seeing the violence, you have to understand that there's a whole violent system still in place.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things, so in my, when I took drama, in my drama class, my monologue that I chose, there's a movie called A Time to Kill with Samuel L. Jackson. Matthew McConaughey is his white lawyer, and essentially some very bad stuff happens. Basically, Samuel L. Jackson's being tried for this case, and at the end, everything looks like it's lost. So Matthew McConaughey does this sort of summation as his defense attorney, and walks through exactly what happened to his little girl, and just no mention of race, just says, there's a little girl walking through, and all of these things happen, and people are crying and stuff. And he asks the jury to close his eyes before he begins, and at the end he says, now imagine she's white. And, I know it's a fictional story and he gets exonerated, but these are the ways that we need to think about. Would we be okay if this is happening to our people, to our community, and realizing that race is a construct, and we need to think about everybody as part of our community? Yeah. And I think has to be a powerful message that we need to just acknowledge and validate the pain that people are feeling, and not, brush it under the rug and go back to business as usual, right? Like, you can't go into a system, benefit from it, and then just be like, well, kind of that sucks for other people, but I'm fine. And the talk about, like, I'm so grateful is nice, but you can't stop there. You can't just stop at being like, I'm grateful and thank you, universe, God, whatever, for this privilege, and then just kind of move on.
Yeah.
You have to use that privilege to deliberately and consciously be anti-racist. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that there are a lot of people yearning for that. And I think that the way that you do that and not come across as the collage of black people or black friends is that you need to voice it, and you need to be vulnerable and say, I don't know what I don't know.
And I think that
sucks.
also adds to people feeling comfortable in these spaces, because it's like there's many people of color who share with me in private how they don't feel comfortable going to a classroom full of all white people and a white teacher. And then especially with what you're talking about, not being acknowledged, it feels like you're not in a welcome or a safe space.
Where you feel invisible and unheard, right? I mean, and then the moment that you do feel visible and heard, there's a lot of anger and rage, right? Because you've gone through this, and I think that there's, in other forms of trauma, we can relate to this, but I think that we need to think about, how do we address this head on, and how do we be conscious of using this language and making sure people are okay being uncomfortable and being vulnerable. There's an authority and kind of a power dynamic with the students and a teacher, that whether you like it or not, and you can, be as humble as you can, but there is a dynamic there. And I think that it is powerful when a teacher, especially a yoga teacher, says, like, look, this is not okay, and so I think that there's importance there. And I think that the structural racism piece touches yoga as much as it touches anything else. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that addresses, because Satya just wrote in the comments, like, can you address, naive comments from other yogis or even on Instagram? And it's really up to, especially the teachers, to keep because all of us as teachers in Kundalini yoga system, we all are to remain as students. So it's to not just reach a comfort zone and stop. like a big part of the narrative, kind of a separate topic, but still related, is like a lot of teacher trainers are uncomfortable because they've worked out for the 30, 40 years. Women do this, say sat, men say nam.
Right.
And now we're asking like, hey, actually there's a whole other gender spectrum. And so then to like, wait, I've mastered it for 30 years and you're telling me I have to learn something new, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. But therein lies your test as a yogi, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah.
It's easy. We always say, right, us New Yorkers, when we go through teacher training, we're during our 6-hour meditations here, sirens and whatever. When we get to solstice on top of that mountain in New Mexico, we are able to meditate in 2 seconds because there's no other sirens around, right? Yeah. But therein lies your test, is that these concepts, when everything's great, it's great. But these concepts are important to realize how we can actually take that discomfort and stretch ourselves. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah.
Right? If everything's comfortable, great, that's nice. But you're meant to stretch yourself. This is your experience here on earth, is to figure out to what bounds can we go as humans and recognize, if we truly believe in that spiritual connection, to recognize that connection, extend it out no matter how uncomfortable that feels, no matter how uncomfortable deconditioning ourselves of these narratives that have gone unchallenged for so long. It doesn't matter how much discomfort we feel, that's our job, right? Isn't that the crux of understanding how we can move beyond these spectrums and recognize truly to be an inclusive and give voice to everybody, so that it's not a dichotomy, it's not an either or. You don't have to choose. You're just a being, right? And I think that what people, I think, and from what I hear having difficult conversations with are, yoga is about just a spiritual being. It's not about this. It's not about black or white. Like, we're all in this together. Yes, we are. But we need to acknowledge that there's some of us who've just had a harder struggle than others. And that needs to just be acknowledged, because that's how you have healing happen.
And the
You can't
system's still
heal.
in place to create this.
It is not only in place, it is prevailing.
Yeah.
Right? It is flourishing because it's been in place like this. And so unless we take apart these things, we will not move anything forward. And this world certainly is a world in progress, right? It's a work in progress, and it will be for generations. But if we can figure out how we can move this conversation, I think we can move towards action. I think everybody wants to put out a statement. They all want to write something perfect. They all want to do things. What are we doing? How are we having this conversation and stretching ourselves? And I think that's where this vulnerability and this discomfort piece is so important to embrace, because what we don't see is invisible to us. If I don't struggle with something, it's invisible to me. And so I cannot have that conversation without that actual perspective, right? And so I think that's why it's so important to invite those perspectives very specifically and deliberately. And it's important to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're over at 20 minutes, but let's go through some of the questions that came through. And let me just pull up. I'm going to pull up the ones that you got the most excited about first.
I love confrontation, so that's the best.
Yeah, I was joking. I was like, the Sagittarians I know love hot topics.
It's my superpower. Make people uncomfortable.
Okay, so first question is this a tick box virtue signaling event to make the community feel like they're doing something?
And for some it might be. I think for some it might be that, okay, great, now we're going to go to a protest, and now what? I think that the difference right now is that people have the time and the space to kind of pause and reflect. And I think that, again, all of these efforts are going to be in vain unless we actually do something about it. And I've shifted from a space of anger and despair to being hopeful that I think we will see some change. And I think those of us who've been doing this work before it was sexy feel a little bit more emboldened to be bold in our edits for what people are writing or what they're publishing, etc. And I think that I'm hoping that more action will come out of this rather than just, I'm hoping it's not a checkbox. So we'll see.
Not a checkbox, not a trend, that we can actually make some really tangible changes, both within our yoga classes, yoga communities, teacher trainings. Absolutely. These are essential. And it's what this time is like shaking us like, hello, look.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things, don't forget the power of conversation and the power of, again, being vulnerable in that conversation.
Yeah.
You know, when people come to a yoga class, it's not only about the chiseled body, right? Like that's the side effect of all of this. But I think it really is to go within and figure out how we can go in and dig out some of the pains and insecurities. And it's important that we sustain this. So exactly to Satya's point, you know, the white community has to see this not like a fad diet. This can't be a blip. This can't be, you know, oh, this happened and then it's business as usual. And I think that's the part that people are starting to, I hope, act upon, is that it can't be business as usual. We're not going back to a normal.
No.
Normal didn't work, right? So let's think about consciously creating a world and cultivating a space where we can leave it better than we have found it. And I think that's the key, is really going in there to hold that space as yoga teachers for that conversation to happen, even if it makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to confront the dark. Okay, so next question. Why, well, this kind of ties into what you said, but why has it taken all the recent events for us to discuss this? And I can speak for myself. It's like, you know, definitely it's something where having this experience as a person of color in America, it's like all my life having to deal with this. And, you know, for all of us people of color. And it's something where definitely I've approached it in the classroom environment, in the training environment, about like really creating equality, but definitely not on Instagram. Like I've been really uncomfortable with it. Like, okay, just post some pretty pictures and post some things about, you know, charity work and to inspire people. But seeing it now as something as like, okay, Instagram's another way of reaching people. Right now we have 51 people here, and maybe hopefully we'll touch their lives to inspire other people and reach out to other people. So it's another tool right now that's become so obvious that we can use as a platform to create community and change, and especially in this COVID time.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is, you know, as you mentioned, there was also some hesitation on your part, right? Like all of us have had that, and one of the you know, I could talk about this for hours, but one of the terms that we talk about is internalized racism, that people of color have been kind of internalizing some of this. And in the rhetoric, there's a whole thing about just kind of pathologizing, right? That Black people understanding, especially Black people in that rhetoric, like the pathology of it is that basically I somehow in my subconscious have accepted that I'm somehow inferior than others. And look, I've been doing this work for a while, I'm telling you, but I still get those moments where I'm like, why am I apologizing for this? And I have to check myself. And just like meditation, this is a practice, right? This is a practice to be conscious about these issues. And I think part of it is that because of social media, the convergence of COVID and people being home and taking time to pause, and the convergence of like social media and the accessibility of it has made a difference, right? I no longer need to go to a specific place to reach 53 people. This is happening right now,
Yeah.
right? I'm not making phone calls or getting on a party line, AKA conference call, right? And I think that a lot of us have, you know, even in my work, it's making things palatable so that, you know, we can get one word in edgewise, so that we're not, you know, we can't be too bold. And I think that it's also taken time. For example, for me and you in our own respective work, we have subject matter expertise now, right? We've been in this for a while. And that gives you a certain sense of emboldenment as well. You know, and I'm so glad and so grateful for people seeking to have these conversations. And I think that's the difference, is that in previously, there hasn't been this sort of many platforms and people wanting to have that conversation. And I think it's kind of been, you know, pushed aside a little bit. So I give the metaphor of like every equity work that I've been doing in like healthcare or teaching, or it's the icing on the cake, right? It's like, oh, we can do this as a one lecture. I'm like, one lecture is not going to cut it, right? Or one course is not even going to cut it. Instead of looking at dismantling structural racism as the icing on the cake for a conversation, we need to bake it into the cake. Right? We need to make this part of our fabric. We need to make this part of the conversation. And I think that's the difference, is that people are starting to really be awakened to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I saw Karen Jo did like this question about the UK, like as a black man in the UK versus the US, and definitely racism still exists in the United Kingdom. I think there's a different mentality of mannerisms in the UK. So like I noticed it when I studied abroad there. I think I studied abroad in like 2002, 2004, I forget when, but it was really early, way back. And I remember the difference with the friends there is in America, friends refer to me as like, oh, Amanbir, my black friend Amanbir. Whereas in the UK, it'd be like, oh, my American friend Amanbir. That was one big difference I noticed.
Yeah, and I think also just to point out that there's this will address like one of the things about how do we disengage people, but also let's not be mistaken that even in the communities of color, this conversation can be uncomfortable. The way that this has manifested across the world has been through colorism, right? People trying to look lighter, and all these filters always make you look lighter, bleaching creams, etc. And so I think that that definitely pans out in colorism across the world. But what's interesting is that still, as we're kind of talking about this topic with people, right, there we go. Part of it is really understanding that there are also communities of color who have internalized this stuff and have a really hard time talking about it as well, and facing their own sort of conditioning around this topic, right? So there, like a lot of, Asian communities have aligned with whiteness, for example, in the United States. There's a lot of like conditioning that if you look at subtle conditioning that has had some pretty interesting consequences, is being called out. And I think that that's really important to understand and bring that out.
Yeah.
I, as a first generation immigrant, I guess my parents had good foresight, but we grew up not in an Indian community. So I'm a social idiot when it comes to Indian people in the US because I don't know, I never had friends, never dated a guy who's Indian, And I think that part of what's important there is understanding that the reason they did that was because they felt like the alignment there and the, sort of cohort was probably not the best if my brother and I were to bring out our own sort of individuality. And I think that that's like a very interesting thing that has come up during this time that I'm like, how did you think to do that? Or, anyway, all of this is interesting, but like essentially calling out that we need to be very conscious and think about not just how this plays out, the US, but also other places. Your identity is what you're mentioning, is it your national identity? Is it your race? What comes out. And I think that it definitely plays out as colorism across the world. But it is, it is interesting. And I think sometimes the initial thought has been to just brush it over, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to point out that, like, where are the black teachers? Like, we live in New York City. How many black Kundalini yoga teachers do I know? Right? Like, these are questions to kind of think about in terms of even pipeline and how we're dismantling some of that structure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and that's the reason why there's so few. It's just like that. I think it's that dynamic of not feeling welcome in spaces. So I was talking to like another black yoga teacher, Siddhi Rishi, and so she's been teaching online, and she said her whole class online is full of black women. And they expressed to her like they love having her teaching the class because they see, especially in society that's built off of the system, they feel really comfortable connecting with her. And it's like why Abajo and I have done like POC projects to create a comfortable space for people, and eventually even a teacher training in that regards. So it's to create these comfortable spaces, and it's not bringing negativity. It's not encouraging separation, but it's acknowledging how the system's in place. But all of us as yoga teachers, whether you're qualified to talk about race or not, need to start educating ourselves and raising the dialogue.
Yes, and I think what you mentioned goes to the heart of this piece of education, right? Like the education, and there have been so many studies looking at this. If I don't see any part of my identity represented, it's not the same. And so if there's one way that we need to really start looking at dismantling this is through the education system. And being a yoga teacher is part of that system, right? And it's not, and I would even venture, it's not even just a safe space, but it's a brave space for people to feel emboldened, to feel empowered, and to feel that there is energy and power and perspective there that has been missing, right? And that it's not okay to just have like, you know, and I think the way that I've looked at it is, you know, the one way to reach people is through feminism around this topic, right? Like women, white women especially, can get behind understanding how that's impacted them. And now just you add the intersectionality of race, it just amplifies some of that so much more.
Yeah.
And it's really important to be able to understand that it's not, when you give, you know, there's 2 seats at the table for some person of color. Now you're basically saying everybody fight amongst yourself, and then you get 2 things, right? But when they're not supported and when the structure is not supported about this, it's really, you're kind of setting people up for failure, which then perpetuates that narrative like, oh, they can't handle that leadership role, right? And versus like really understanding that to have these conversations and to have a diverse perspective, you need to invite and very consciously provide those positions equity, right? Like it's not just equality of numbers on the table. Do they have assistants? Do they have support structures? Do they have people that they can talk to about these things? And I think that's really, really important in really understanding that that perspective needs to be actively sought out.
Yeah. So let's go through like one more. I think we answered most of the questions through our conversation, which went over 20 minutes. Thanks for those that are still here. And let me see if there's one that really we didn't cover. This is one that came up that is different than all the other ones, is our thoughts regarding free classes for people of color, or what white teachers can offer to people of color to encourage them more into the classroom space. And if offering it for free, doesn't there need to be energetic exchange?
That's a great question. It's a little tricky, I think. I think the answer is not just say, because I think what we're trying to say is that there's nothing fragile or like delicate about communities of color. So just don't treat them as much, right? So yes, they've received negative treatment so far. Giving them positive treatment just because they're a person of color is also not the greatest way to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the way that we think of, for example, I'll give you an example of a very structural issue with this. MCATs, PCATs, LSATs, all of these entry exams, right? To get into professional school, traditionally, Black and brown folks, especially Black and Latinx, tend to be the poorer scorers. And so what's that?
There's a question like, will I save it? Yeah, I'll save it to
yes.
Yeah, okay.
And the question comes up is like, well, they don't perform so well. And so should we do away with the exam? And again, I don't know what the answer is to that, but the question really is, if you do feel that the exam is validated, reliable, and rigorous enough to predict that somebody will do well in these professional schools, the answer is not to take them away, which then also perpetuates this notion that, oh, we need to make room for Black and brown people. They're not as able. And so we need to remove that obstacle. It's how do we get them the resources that everybody else has to train for those exams and to do well in those exams. And I think that's the way that we have to start thinking about it, is it's not removing barriers. Black folks are extremely resilient, by the way. Communities of color have been experiencing resilience since they were, womb to tomb, right? Like, this is not an issue of like, they can't overcome barriers. We keep saying like, oh, they beat the odds, it's good for them. But we need to change the odds, right? It's not about like, hey, we're going to move this stuff. We need to change the odds so that it doesn't matter if you're from a community of color, that you just get a pass, because that also then perpetuates this notion that they need a pass to begin with. And that's not the issue. The issue is that there's deep-seated stuff in the education system to get to that point, right? So I don't know if the answer is to provide a free class. I think maybe I challenge that we can do classes where we're really inviting folks to say, hey, I want to be deliberate as a white yoga teacher to have a conversation about racism. I cannot do it alone because I don't have that perspective. There's things that are blind to me. So can you seek and say, would anybody be willing to, join, and kind of we can have this conversation to share perspectives? And not to say that like, just keep calling on your persons of color who are your friends and partners and whatever to keep holding that space. That's also exhausting. I'm exhausted in my work to continue to like cajole people and be like, hey, you're doing such a great job as a white person. I never tell my friends of color who do this equity work to
Yeah.
say, you know, sorry, yes, Latinos or Latin American is fine. But I think that part of it is that we need to really be deliberate about like what are we trying to say? And I think it's okay to speak the intent and speak that we don't know things and that we'll mess up, and that's okay to trip over things.
Yeah. Yeah, like for me, like I went to Cooper Union, which is free tuition for everyone. But also I was given an opportunity.
Also
Like,
a highly competitive school, by the way. Don't
yeah.
just, it's amazing.
Yeah, but I also got into Columbia, I got into UPenn, I got into Tufts, and all of these institutions offered me scholarships. And that actually made it, because I grew up in the projects, so it made it available for me to be able to like have options of colleges. So I worked hard and got great grades in high school, and then I had these opportunities because of scholarships. And that definitely is a program that I feel will help people, because society is still built in a certain way. But it's a very delicate thing in yoga classes that it does not come off as patronizing. So I don't necessarily know if there's like a correct right or wrong answer within the polarities, but it's definitely something that you have to be mindful of with the things that you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and look, and at the end of the day, you have to continue. We're not going to solve this problem in a day, right? I tell my students very deliberately to embrace a lack of closure. This took hundreds of years, if not more, to build, right? Like this is not going to be fixed in a day. And it's also, we have to check our egos to find resolution and like make ourselves feel good that we're doing something. This is a deeply disturbing issue, right?
Yeah.
So we're not going to fix it, but can we make very deliberate choices to look at the underlying issues, right? Education system, I'd argue, is a pretty big issue in this country, especially if you look at public versus private versus, thinking about how funds are distributed. Right now, certainly the White House situation is not helping. But, maybe the silver lining is that more people, because they're angry and waking up, are like, this sucks. And
exactly.
maybe
It's
more
hard.
people,
It's hard to
yeah,
sleep with what's going on in the White House. It's like,
totally.
hey, I just want to be in the clouds and meditate on God's name. It's like,
Right.
and then you have the White House narrative. It's like, it's harder just to spiritually bypass.
Yeah, and it's it's also like, again, you can't turn the other cheek, and I think that's the hard part, and that we all have to uplift each other through that. It's
Yeah.
not, even with the White House, whatever's happening, it's, dude, this stuff has been around for a long time,
Yeah.
right? And so, sure, maybe we've hit a point where we're like, all right, guys, enough is enough. But that's what we need to awaken through these very painful conversations where people will have a lot of fragility and guilt around talking about, yeah, I didn't speak up about this stuff before.
Yeah.
So if we had, Obama in the house, this stuff was still going on, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it's important to recognize and just kind of, again, remember that this is going to be a long time, and that the way we parent, the way we talk, I see this, the intergenerational healing, right? Like, we have to decondition ourselves, but we also have to let our children know, right? Like my kids, my 5.5-year-old the other day said, very deliberately, oh, here we go again. She's saying racism, like we talk about all this stuff. But if we don't parent properly, they're not going to learn the vocabulary of how to actually continue the conversation forward. So I think it is really important. And to the point of, I think, yeah, exactly, the intersectionality is actually a really wonderful area that's being given more momentum in research, especially because things have always been in silos, and we are not silos, right? You're not a black man or a yogi, or there's intersectionality of a lot of issues, right?
Yeah.
And I think in research and in this narrative of education, we're looking at, so it's not just gender that impacts, right? It's a spectrum of gender, but then the intersectionality of like being a person of color and identifying as transgender or identifying whatever as an immigrant, et cetera, like all those things have a synergistic effect. They're not like it doesn't double the impact. It's just like triples it, right? If you have two things. So those things are really important. I'm glad that that somebody brought that up, because the intersectionality is really, really important to think about.
Yeah. It's like that totem pole kind of analogy. It's just like, so if the bottom is at black, and then within that you have like black and transgender, black and queer, black and other genders. So it's something that that intersectionality is relevant to really discuss and understand and to explore. So I'm glad there's a lot more conversations about this and how it impacts us.
Yeah, and it's gonna also mean giving people the presence and time to just also allow themselves to just be sometimes, right? Like I need time after I teach about this to like just kind of meditate and just be me or watch something funny or whatever, because there's a lot of space that people of color are asked to hold for many people, right? And it, like I said, it's exhausting, but we need to continue this conversation. And, you know, and this means in the yogi community very specifically, we're all about healing. So we have to acknowledge these pains. We have to think about how we're being very deliberate about this topic. And I think that it's really important. I'm glad you invited me to this. How many, 29 minutes over now. But, you know, like thinking about the thirst people have for this conversation, I'm so encouraged to see more people being like, what do I do? And that's the right place to start, right? That I don't know what I don't know, and I need to figure out what's happening. And I really encourage more conversations like this.
Yeah, so yeah, we can have future conversations too, Vibhuti.
Yeah, happy to do it now that I know what Instagram Live means.
Yeah, and now I know how long it really will take us. And that people do have an attention span beyond 20 minutes, so it's great.
Yes, yes. And you know, and inviting more uncomfortable questions, I think would be really great. Like racist. Oh, this is a whole other one about the development of the human brain and what this actually does. I'll quickly say that there's also research showing that persons of color specifically have an underlying sort of their baseline, what we call risk under normal times because of racism is elevated, which then also predisposes them to disease, right? So I think that is a very important conversation to also have is, you know, what does all this do to our brain? What does all this do? But that's where I think yogis come in, because we know how to empower people and move them beyond their pain to a place of healing. And that's where we come in, right? Like there is deep pain and we acknowledge that and we have to. And then we start using these powerful tools to say, hey, we got this, right? And we're going to do this together. So I think that's really important. I
hear your teacher calling you in the background.
Yeah, I might have to also, we might have to continue this conversation.
Yeah, so let's continue this conversation. This is not just the only one. So the first of many, because we have to keep it going. And thank you, Dr. Vibhuti Arya.
Thank you, my love.
Yeah, and follow her. She now has 3 posts on Instagram.
Oh, this is so fun.
I post like, 5 a year, so it's okay.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you all for participating and thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us and being part of that. And please reach out to us and we'll definitely continue this.
There's like hearts going on the screen. I got to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
So cool. All right. Bye.
All right, bye everyone. Bye. I'll save it. Okay.